G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and I hope that you are having a brilliant end to your week. Let me know what's on for the weekend. Mine is very slow, but I've got to catch up on a little bit of admin and a bit of work because the doctor has given me the go ahead to do my chemotherapy next week. But this will mark the halfway of my 12 rounds of treatment. So let's get into it and then get it over with. Now, legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over. We need to look at some of the largest strikes, if not the largest drone strikes, but we're going to talk a little bit more about then strategic strikes and their impact overall on war, potential of an important air defense system. We're going to talk in the maps about something not being spoken about to do with then occupation of an oblast. Of course, in the mapping, we'll be comparing maps, looking at some other bits and pieces as per usual. We need to look over what the old chief of army, of course, Valery Zaluzhnyi, has said about the reality of this war and the recovery of not only 1991 borders, but 2022 borders. He gives us a bit of a reality check here. And regardless if you love or hate Zaluzhnyi, in my opinion, he has been correct on many things. And a lot of those reasons is why he was pushed out the door. We then need to have a look at the new Russian senior command. To go a little bit in depth to that, we sort of brushed over it the other day with who are these guys getting put into more senior positions? What does this tell us about the Russian forces going into the future too? And we'll also be talking about a Wall Street Journal article where the US, Trump, has really pushed back on this unconditional ceasefire. And now NATO is saying that the senior leadership there is saying that Russia in the next coming years is going to be a massive threat after then years of EU and European NATO saying to us that Russia was strategically destroyed, relying on dishwashers and washing machines and shovels for their fighting. So why has there been such a shift? Okay, so we'll go through all of that, but I want to start here. And I want to start here because I can't wait for all of those that called me a propagandist, releasing misinformation, all of the above, to then send through their apology. And it seems like that every week, every couple of weeks, we have something new like this. We're going to see, we reported that it was heralded as a conspiracy, as misinformation, as propaganda, and then evidence comes out to show that. And what this is to do with is then a Ukrainian Special Forces operation against Enerhodar nuclear power plant, also known as Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the ZNPP. And this has come out. Now, if you want to see in an interview actually below, we talk specifically about this. But I was also given off camera a lot more information from other contacts given than the nature of this at the time that I could report on. And in this article, this gentleman here says separately, he mentions another operation about which there was a very limited information in the public sphere. The operation in Enerhodar in 2022. In the story of philosopher, who is then the code name of the soldier here, it occupies a special place, both in essence and strategic consequences. So in essence, it was the first operation on the water for the active duty units, although the fate of that operation, from at least my information that I was given, was very, very poor, given movement across that water, and some early warning did spot those moving across. But again, we did report on this. Now let's talk about strikes. As overnight, Ukraine has had one of the largest drone strike against Russia, with hitting multiple industrial areas, multiple areas in Moscow, and in oil refineries, all of this. Now, it's hard to get numbers on this. That's why I say maybe the largest, one of the largest, in and around reported, say, 400 drones. And these attacks are getting more and more numerous. But we see a lot like this. And this was said then a few weeks back when there was another large attack, that Ukraine's new drone strategy is to cripple Moscow's airports and make the Russian population pay. Now, what I'll say is, on the very surface, to make the population pay, it may seem like strategic strikes like this, strikes against an infrastructure, whatever, that the population is directly affected. On the surface, it would seem like this could make then further resistance to their government's war effort and stir unrest. But this is based only very surface level, because it's not based in the history and the outcome of bombing campaigns. It's actually very much the opposite. And Ukraine should actually know this better than anyone else. Has the Russian bombing campaigns weakened or reinforced the idea that this war must be fought and won against the adversary? Okay? And this was most documented during bombing raids in cities in World War II across Europe. And you can see many different writers and authors speak about this, from Mr. Winston Churchill through to then this John Galbraith here, who says there was no measurable effect on German war production until very late in the war. The belief that morale bombing would produce victory was one of the great illusions of the conflict. So then, why do we have strategic bombing like this? Why is Russia striking? Why is Ukraine striking? Well, war has never and will never be won by strategic bombing. All this does is it raises the cost of war and reduces the ability for your army to stage land warfare. And Russia's strikes from 2022 to present is the perfect example of this. It will not win or lose a war, but it raises then the cost for your adversary to put their armed forces, their army, into play. At the end of the day, we need to come to the understanding, it needs to be known, that war like this is won or lost by the ground units, and everything else is in support of that or to degrade that on the other side. So yes, this is going to raise the cost, but this needs to be done in succession to then land movements as well. And in war like this, to actually reduce massively a state's industrial power, their economic output, is massively difficult, just due to, well, one, Russia has just the geography on their side of the size, but also in modern states, just the size of those outputs and the ability to rebuild as well. And we see Ukraine is the perfect example of this, of continued Russian strikes over years against energy facilities with far more advanced systems and far more numerous than Ukraine could hope to have. And how big of effect is that? So again, apply the logic both ways. Ukraine haven't been able to use their airports for 3.5 years. What has that actually done? Could we see the opposite and actually an increase in resistance against your adversary, saying, yep, we need to then fight and win this war, and maybe a push up in even people volunteering? Now, this is a claim going around all the Russian pages saying that this is a Patriot system, some 100 kilometers from the LBS, or line of control is the word I would more likely use. Of course, a Patriot is an incredibly important air defense system, but from this footage, it's just not good enough footage to come to the conclusion that it was definitely a Patriot system hit. What we do know is something was hit, and we can see in this footage that it does have secondary explosions. Much more than that, we don't really know. But this is where the claimed geolocation is just to the west of Dnipro, some 100 kilometers behind the line of control. So realistically, it's probably much further than that. And we can see that drone really struggling with that footage, then relaying back to. But something was hit there. Was it Patriot? Maybe. Wasn't it? I don't know. Would it make sense for a Patriot system to be just outside of Dnipro? Absolutely. It's a very important area. But can we confirm it? No. So let's then have a look at the maps. Now, before we actually break down the maps, a couple of things I want to go over. And I got sent this from someone who is behind the scenes here. By the way, nobody talks about this, but the Russians are asking Ukraine to withdraw from the 4 regions that they claim. However, perhaps within weeks or a couple of months, Luhansk is likely to be fully under Russian control. As we know, Luhansk is about 99% occupied. There's only a very small sliver of Luhansk just up here that is still under Ukrainian control, but Russia is moving in this direction. So what happens then? They can't ask Ukraine to withdraw from a region where they are not. Will then Russia just limit the demands to remaining 3 regions to appear more reasonable to the public and Trump? Or will they just go, well, you didn't want to withdraw from Luhansk, so we took it, and now we're asking for Kharkiv instead? And I think it is more likely the former of, well, now we're only requesting a withdrawal from 3. Okay, so let's have a look on the maps. Of course, here is Ukraine, the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Any red check that you see on this map is occupied by Russia over the last 24 hours. Now, this is actually going to look very similar to yesterday. Actually, it does have a bit of a double take, but Russia is doing exactly what I said they would do on the east side of Pokrovsk. But firstly, we need to look at, of course, where the border lies between Russia and Ukraine. You've got Belgorod Oblast, Kursk Oblast, and then Bryansk Oblast, of course, making the borderline here. And Putin has spoken again about the buffer zone. He says that it's concerning Kursk, Bryansk, and Belgorod that there are drone attacks, sabotage, reconnaissance actions happening then across the border, and that a decision has been made to create a buffer zone of security along the Russian border, along these regions, given the situation there. So what we have seen is we can see where Russia has crossed from Belgorod into then Kharkiv. We can see where they've crossed from Kursk into Sumy. And could we see something further than northwest of here? Could we see a buffer zone somewhere? Again, really don't know. The capacity for the Russian force to launch along a size of Frontline that much, at this point in time, I don't believe is there. But I could definitely see the strategic consequence of pushing across somewhere a lot further away, because Russia is numerically superior on the battlefield. That will draw forces away, doing basically a Kursk 2.0, but they're not going to be handed that again. Well, hopefully we don't actually really know. So let's turn that on. Red check. Let's come down and talk about Pokrovsk as a whole. So the eastern side is what I want to see. Now, you'll be looking and thinking, well, this looks exactly like yesterday. And you're right. What we saw yesterday, if we go back yesterday and then turn this on, oh, I don't know what's happened there, was then area just here being made out from Novopoltavka. And then we step up to then today, if this will move. Sorry, this. So we can see, let me do it this way. 20th, 21st, 22nd, a step then further out from Novu-Lenivkia. And this is what I have been saying the Russians will do in here is they'll step out and fatten to reduce saturation of then Ukrainian weapon systems and increase their own lines of communication and decrease the risk of being cut off. And we're seeing that happen. But we're also seeing this sort of now push out to the northeast and, of course, could be forming that then western flank of Toretsk. So, of course, this is now getting enveloped on this front. And then we see from Pokrovsk to the west, we do see further Russian movement in the direction of Dnipro border, just south of Uzbenivkia. Again, not surprised to see this at all. But let's have a little bit more of a look of the breakdown in some of these areas. If we compare the Syriac map, same direction here, we can confirm definite movement there. But we see this coming out from then Ukrainian commander as well, that our logistics in Pokrov's direction are collapsing to zero. The high command should finally take this into account and focus efforts on destroying enemy drone crews. Against the backdrop of constant orders to observe and destroy enemy infantry, enemy FPV drone operators are being ignored, even though they carry out 50% of the enemy's ground tasks. Delayed reaction will lead to a collapse on the front and the immediate fall of Pokrovsk's defences. And this is this whole sector in here that we are seeing then still moving. And Julian Ropke, who you and I, we have had a lot of criticism here for overly optimistic, sometimes leaning delusional views of this war, not backed by the reality, at least as far as we see it. We try and be as objective as possible, but you can't say that he isn't one of Ukraine's biggest supporters. And he shares this. We'll get to the English part here, also sharing that same screenshot that we saw. He says, Ukraine officer warns of the collapse of the front and the associated fall of the defences of Pokrovsk. The situation not only here is critical for the Ukrainian army, as I've repeatedly reported in recent weeks, especially in the area of drones, so the Russians have caught up extremely, if not overtaken, the Ukrainian defenders. This backs up what I said yesterday is, in my opinion, throughout most of the war, Ukraine has had drone dominance, but Russia has, at the moment, at a minimum parity, if not dominance in the drone space, due to that complete overmatch of the fibre optic controlled drones. He says hundreds of fibre optic drones are now deployed every day. They are almost no defences against them. As a result, Ukraine is losing far more vehicles than it can replace. This makes logistics, as the officer writes, almost impossible. In addition, Russian infantrymen are constantly arriving, and for the past month, numerous Russian armoured vehicles are advancing together with civilian vehicles. We do see Russia is recruiting a huge amount of soldiers and deploying huge amounts of soldiers into the battlefield. The failure of Western partners has led Zelensky now being willing to accept any compromise. So the failure here, that there's a willingness maybe to accept compromise. However, since the same failure also means the Russian army has no reason whatsoever to rely on negotiations, the situation will continue to worsen. And this is what we have said, is that you only have cards on the table if you're willing to play those cards. But if it gets into the position where Russia see light at the end of tunnel or better conditions further on, then there is no reason for them to stop. So it's carrot or stick. Stick ain't working. No one's prepared to then hold out the carrot. But what I will say with this is, do not underestimate how much of a beating a motivated adversary can endure. There's still a lot left in the tank. Is it enough to swing the tide of the war? No. Is it enough to sustain current paces and increase losses on the other side? Yes, absolutely. So we'll see a definite continuation here. We're seeing some of now the most even like pro out there accounts now starting to, well, now not being able to ignore some of the realities of which we have been talking about. I'm going to be very, very interested to see how some of these accounts' audiences respond to when there's just glaring truths of which they have to eventually report on. Like these YouTube accounts that is just daily, the Russians have been completely demolished and they've got nothing left of the tank and Putin has stage bazillion fucking cancer and blah, blah, blah. Eventually, these accounts are not going to be able to hide what is actually happening. It's going to be too much in their face. I'm going to be very interested to see what their audiences actually do then, or where they go with that. Or will they just maintain the same narrative of Russia's being destroyed and then quickly shift the narrative into it would have been a complete victory if not for Trump, which is completely bullshit, because do not think for a second Trump inherited a winning war. To be honest, if you think the situation is bad now, it could be significantly worse if there was a Harris administration, maybe not worse right now, but potentially much worse in 12 months. We'll go over more of that in a second. Let's continue looking at the maps. Of course, this push out here that we spoke about. Then we come down and we have then the Velikanova-Silka front line. We really have two areas in here. So we have sort of the Novopil area we will look at first, and this Zelene Pole area. Of course, this showing which we think in reality that this is all filled in, not what this map is showing, but saying that the Russian forces have taken control over both Zelene Pole and Novopil. Also movements near Vilne Pole as well, pushing out in this direction and pushing back. The Ukrainian forces have pushed back into Berlatsky as well. I just wanted to confirm that as I read it. So a lot of movement on this front line. And we will continue to see this towards the border of Zaporizhia as well. That'll be something that'll be a very interesting update in the coming months. Now, we'll have a look in Rozliv, Konstantinopil, Bahatar frontline, and Odrane area in here. Somewhere I have been speaking about a lot, and that in Suryak's update here saying that the Russian forces have entered Odrane from the south and have taken over half the locality, as well as still suggesting Bahatar is under Russian control. Bahatar, at this point in time, I do not know, but saying that they're out to where my cursor is at the moment. And then we're going to pick right up and we're going to head back into Volchansk. I don't have the video saved here, but there was a Russian TOS thermobaric multiple launch rocket system hit in and around on the Russian side of the border here. What we do always report on either hits of these or when we see those striking, due to the way that those systems work, is really one of the last systems to be striking areas before there is a push of Russian infantry through that area. And we see today, so that vehicle was taken out, but we do see rare updates occurring in here. So at least by Suryak maps, he's showing just where my cursor is here and just this sector out here that there has been a couple of advances. Again, geolocations in Volchansk is almost impossible just due to how it is completely destroyed. Now, Valery Zaluzhnyi, of course, for many an incredibly popular figure, for many a very unpopular figure. But what I will say is, I believe he was pushed out the door because he threatened Zelensky's threatened Zelensky's position with his popularity. And he was a bit too truthful for, I think, a lot of the media, saying that along the lines of the 23 counteroffensive that failed, that he was saying that the warfare is now positional and attritional, and also saying that Ukraine needs, if they want to hope, they need to mobilise 500,000 men, which we know is correct. If he was listened to back in 23, instead of pushed out the door into another position, that 500,000 people were mobilised and trained, the battlefield would look significantly different right now. Maybe it would look similar, but Ukraine's cards on the table would be significantly more powerful. And he says this on RBC Ukraine. They're quoting him here. No return to 91 borders. Former Ukraine's army chief warns of Russia's war potential. That Ukraine should not expect a return to 91 borders. Russia has the resources to continue the war. Now, he says this at a Ukrainians Weapons in the World Forum, saying, I hope that there are no more people in this room who still believe some kind of miracle or wonder in a white swan that will bring peace to Ukraine, restore 91 or even 2022 borders, and bring great happiness afterward. In my personal opinion, as long as the enemy has the resources, the strength, and the means to strike our territory and attempt localised offensive actions, they will continue to do so. According to him, Russia's ability to wage war will primarily depend on its access to resources. He noted that since the end of 2023, Russia has been fighting a war of attrition. What I will say is it takes two to tango. Both sides are fighting a war of attrition. But what I saw was Russia accepted the war of attrition going over a number of years much earlier. And we see this with the way they fought, and as well as reshuffling some of the command positions, aka putting an economist in for long-term war. And I think that earlier acceptance has led to then the creation of things like the Surovikin line, the mobilisation of more assets to go to forces, and a number of that. I think that acceptance of attritional style war has led more so to the position that we see now, rather than the idea that technology and manoeuvre will eventually bring then all of the successes for Ukraine on the battlefield. Zaluzhnyi believes that victory in a war is only possible by completely destroying Russia's ability to wage it, saying, I mean the destruction of its military economic potential. Under our current conditions, with an enormous shortage of human resource and the catastrophic economic situation we're facing, we can only talk about high-tech war survival, one that uses minimal human resources and minimal economic means to achieve maximum effect. So saying that due to our catastrophic economic situation, our massive shortage of human resources, of men, we have to rely on high-tech equipment to have less people, to have larger impact on the Russian forces. But I don't see where this is going to go from here. As I said, land war battles like this, we are still, at the end of the day, the most important element is still the men in the trenches moving ground. Technology is great, but technology does not seize and hold terrain. That is what the infantry, armour and artillery are there for. Ukraine is simply incapable of fighting any other kind of war given its demographic and economic realities, and we shouldn't even entertain that thought. So don't get stuck into a war of attrition, small Soviet army versus big Soviet army that it's not going to win. And he's giving some reality checks, I think, here, and I'm putting himself absolutely, I would say, in the firing line. And again, Ukraine's priority has always been its 1991 borders, and I've said from the very beginning that this is based, and anything less than this is going to be a loss. There's going to be a problem trying to, I guess, sell that victory as well. But Ukraine does face critical shortage of munitions, sort of. The West has not been able to give Ukraine enough, or be willing to give Ukraine enough of that due to our own industrial power, but also our leaders want to do that. But more significantly is the ability to replenish manpower as well. Again, leads into where I believe Zaluzhnyi was 100% correct, saying that we need to mobilise 500,000 guys now, and we are now a year and a half, 2 years past when he said that. That would be making significant changes right now, because I see that there's plenty of stuff going in, but you need guys on the back end of that still firing it. Now, let's go into a few things that I guess line up with all of that. Now, NATO Secretary Mark Rutte has said this: Russia is at an enormous pace reconstituting itself. They're producing at this moment ammunition at a level which has not been seen in recent decades. They produce 4 times as much ammunition as the whole of NATO is producing as we speak. They're reconstituting their armies. Their whole economy is on a war footing. What I'll say is I don't believe the whole economy is on a war footing, and that would line up with the expenditures we see as well in larger wartime versus what it actually is. But anyway, we have had open sources saying from intelligence services that by 2027, 2030, 2032, they might be able to be at such a level of strength that they could try something silly. What we have to do as NATO is make sure that Putin knows that if he attacks now or in the near future, that our reaction will be devastating. So this bloke here, Jimmy Carr of Wish, he's also been telling us, along with Callas and Ursula and all these other figures, they've been telling us for years that Russia's near collapse and that it would take decades and decades to recover. And that just a small trickle of weapons into Ukraine and another couple of $1 billion will lead to Russia's defeat. And now that you're saying, well, they're producing 4 times as much of us, and in a year and a half, they may have the power to threaten NATO. Well, if that is fact, Mr. Root, then the continuing this war in the state will not go well. If in 18 months you think that they may have the power to threaten NATO, I can guarantee that Ukraine is not going to push that back. Now, what I'll say in this is there's a lot more informational push in what he says here rather than the reality of the situation. Now, yes, Russia is producing a massive amount of weapon systems. No one should be surprised by that, with the way that industry can pick up like that, especially in a country like Russia. But from everything I've seen, from industry to military to politically, Russia has no goals or the means to fight NATO, at least head on. I've always said Russia's threat to NATO has always been ideology. It's not up the guts assault. They know that as well. But this narrative shift from Russia is a washing machine, stripping out chips, fighting with shovels, to now what we're seeing Mr. Root and other European leaders say about we need to do all this, this is informational war. What they're trying to do here is use this narrative to say that this is a real threat to you at home sitting in Belgium or Berlin or Paris or wherever, that this is a real threat to you. Therefore, you need to continue public support for this war. And of course, that impacts where the media then eat that up, and then that goes into how democratic institutions get voted into power. So this is more trying to, this is a real threat to you. Like if you're sitting in the middle of Munich somewhere going, well, what is this threat to me? They need to sell it as this is a direct threat to you, and therefore we need to continue spending X amount of money. It's more that than actually a real threat of Russia crossing that border, because Russia knows how that would go as well. It would be catastrophic for everyone. Now, the Wall Street Journal has had this, and the WSJ sometimes should be the SJW. So take all of this with a grain of salt, as it is heavily biased in this war and heavily biased against Mr. Trump too. Some interesting bits in this. On a call on Monday, Trump told European leaders that Russian President Vladimir Putin isn't ready to end the war in Ukraine because he thinks he's winning. And I also believe that Trump thinks Putin is winning in the war. And if you look at the war and the current what's moving on the war, I also believe, it's not a Kremlin talking point, I believe that Putin is winning the war. What other metrics do we want to use? Okay, I'm happy to hear it. I'm happy to interview anyone who has a differing opinion to that too, but all the YouTubers I reach out to will never speak to me. Probably says something. In the officials characterised as rambling and at times contradictory call, Trump also said he believed Putin ultimately decide peace, albeit on Russia's terms. They said Europeans' takeaway was that Trump didn't believe that a near-term peace deal was in the offing and that the war was Europe's problem. Trump has basically said things very similar to this. But we do know that Putin does desire peace if he can take those areas without fighting through. It is far cheaper for Russia to sign a deal to take those oblasts than risk and gamble fighting through those, because at the end of the day, you don't know how that is going to go. War is still a risk. Also, in paragraphs below, they say some Europeans on the call Monday insisted that the outcome of any talks at the Vatican must be an unconditional ceasefire, but Trump again demurred, saying he didn't like the term unconditional. Now, Trump said he had never used that term, although he used it when calling for a 30-day ceasefire in his post on Truth Social on May 8th. The Europeans eventually agreed to drop their insistence on the objective. Now, what I will say on this is the term unconditional here. This is why a lot of this is getting laughed at in many corners of the globe, because, of course, nothing is unconditional when there is a different power than metric used and different levels of power in this. And the way I see it is Trump understands Putin's power, politics, style, diplomacy far more than these European leaders. And that's why Trump has come to the conclusion that the unconditional ceasefire is just a ploy to get Putin to say no to it. They know he's going to say no to it. It's a ploy to get then the US to place more sanctions on Russia, because Europe can do sanctions, but without the US, they are greatly reduced. And they're doing this because they know Putin will never agree to it, as it only benefits Ukraine and negatively impacts Russia. Their primary goal, the Europeans' primary goal, is to weaken Russia first and Ukraine's future secondly to that. That's how I see it, and that this is merely a language used. The unconditional of it sounds fantastic. The conditions is no conditions can come, and we're also not going to lift anything that impacts Russia negatively on the economic side. They know he's going to say no, and trying to some way trick Trump or bring Trump on the side of then putting in more sanctions. And Trump is pushing back on that, saying no, because if we just keep putting sanctions in, we're never going to bring him to the table. And what I do think Trump is more of a power politics leader, like we see with Putin, more a sort of a liberal moralist leader. And this is why we've seen Europe's industry over the past decades, their industrial power absolutely fall out the arse, because there's more belief in balancing and Wilsonianism principles rather than sheer power of warfare. And we're probably entering a new age of diplomacy as well, given how this war will likely end up. Now, let's talk about Russian command, because we brushed over this, but this is important. And this Daria Masikot, she's a senior fellow, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Russia and Eurasia program. The new commander of Russian ground forces is Mordchev. Previously, operational group center commander in Donetsk and longest in post-operation group commander. It signals a few things about the next phase for the Russian army. That his appointment here is a signal that the military intends to integrate experience from the war in Ukraine. The position is responsible for force, posture, employment, training, readiness, and other roles critical for reconstituting the army. So future army, not just now. As the most experienced operational group commander, he could have also played the high command role as deputy commander of the special military operation in Rostov, along with other senior generals like Kim Orodskoy. The choice to put him as ground force commander role is telling. By putting him here, it means they're looking to the future of the army and how to convert experience from the war changes for future force. This consistent and many other learning activities in Russia High Command at present. He's the first Gen X Ground Forces chief, and the first who was commissioned as Russian officer and not a Soviet one. So the ones in these positions previously were Soviets, not as then a Russian officer. What does have a lot to do with different military doctrines and even outlooks here. Like many other Ground Force commanders, he hails from commands in Siberia and has not spent too much time as a Moscow staff officer. His appointment should be viewed in the context of Russian military reconstitution, military learning and reform, and significant modifications to the force that will accelerate now until 2030. More to come in these topics in then upcoming reports, and we'll keep an eye on those. And I got sent this across from another gentleman saying this about the Russian generals. Mordchev is, as I can see, highly respected and regarded. Some in the Russian channel speak of him as the new Zhuikov, although Russians are prone to exaggeration. Nevertheless, people speak of him as very capable, highly professional, and that he's part of the new generation and is totally taking a different approach. Some people wrote that working on his staff is great experience. At the start of the war, he commanded the 8th Guards of the army and took Mariupol. He was in command of Avdiivka operation, and he was commended by Putin and got a Gold Star Hero of Russia. He was until now commander of the Central Group Forces. As new commander-in-chief ground forces, he is responsible for doctrine, organisation, equipment and training. So in a position to shape the way Russian ground forces will be implementing what they have learned. Some say he might be the next chief of the general staff after Gerasimov. As for Solichok, who's now filled his position, He's also a fighting general. He took over Kursk operation in September and is the one responsible for the whole counteroffensive operation. He is now, he's taking over his position as commander of the Central Group of Forces. Can't say much more. As I've read, he is also popular and respected. These are new guys shaped in war. And it seems Russia is promoting this kind of commander, which could explain their battlefield successes. So they're outing the old Soviet-era commanders and bringing in then guys with real warfare experience who have grown up in the Russian army, not in the Soviet then military. So it will be very interesting to see then the future of this, and we'll keep up to date with that. Legends, I hope that you have a fantastic day, and I will speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.